Okay, I would like to start with two examples. The first example refers to a judgment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In March 2016, the ultra-nationalist Serbian politician Vojislav Šešelj was cleared of all charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity by the third chamber of the tribunal. However, the verdict was by no means consensual. On the one hand, the chamber acknowledged that Šešelj had repeatedly and systematically incited hatred against the non-Serbian and Muslim population and had called for the expulsion and forcible transfer of Croats and Bosnian Muslims. On the other hand, two of the three judges did not find sufficient evidence to establish a direct link between Šešelj's statements and the atrocities committed by his troops. The majority took the view that Šešelj's talk of the creation of Greater Serbia and his calls for expulsion were more a quote of a political venture than a criminal project, an expression of an alternative program that would never be put into practice, end of quote. By contrast, the third judge, Flavia Lattanzi, firmly opposed this position and suggested a direct correlation between Šešelj's speeches, their humiliating and dehumanizing effects, and the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by his men. According to Lattanzi, there is ample evidence to conclude that he incited the crimes charged in the indictment through all of his inflammatory speeches, calling clearly and directly for the expulsion and forcible transfer of the non-Serbs, in addition to his speeches in which he denigrated and dehumanized the Croats, comparing them to primates and vampires and qualifying them as cowards. In the same way, he called the Bosnian Muslims Balija or Pogani, excuse my pronunciation, which he himself translated as excrements. By using these terms together with this constant reference to genocide committed by the Croats during World War II, and the saying, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and revenge is blind, Vojislav Šešelj also took the risk that murder, torture, cruel treatment, and destruction would be committed. The juxtaposition of the two opinions, the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion, not only reveals a fundamentally different assessment of the role and impact of Šešelj's speeches, but also two different conceptions of speech and language. Thus, the majority opinion sees speech and language primarily as a means of communication and of expressing opinions that does not produce any immediate effects. In contrast, Judge Lattanzi holds Šešelj clearly accountable for his inflammatory speeches. Moreover, she views language not only as a neutral tool for expressing our thoughts, but as an effective means of discrimination capable of severely damaging or destroying the social and material existence of populations. A quite different case of discrimination and jurisdiction is analyzed in detail by Wendy Brown in her book Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution. In 2010, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission that all state regulation of campaign finance aimed at preventing the excessive influence of powerful corporations on politics is an impermissible restriction on the rights to free speech. The reason given is that corporations are fictitious persons who are, just like natural persons, are entitled to the right to free speech as guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Accordingly, any regulation of campaign financing constitutes in both inappropriate governmental intervention in the free market of ideas and discrimination against certain speakers on the basis of status or content. Speakers, corporations. Justice Kennedy even goes so far as to claim that, I quote, First Amendment freedoms need breathing space to survive, end of quote. A statement that might be worth rereading in the light of the murder of George Floyd and his repeated plea, I can't breathe. The Supreme Court's line of argument is made possible not only by considering corporations as persons possessing fundamental rights that are all too often denied to natural persons, but also, as Brown points out, by figuring speech as analogous to capital in the political marketplace. Speech is understood here neither as a value in itself, nor as a mode of being in the world with others. Rather, it is reduced to an instrumental means of maximizing profit on the political marketplace of ideas. This brings me to the connection between language and discrimination. Indeed, as Martin Reisiegel makes clear, language plays a key role in most cases of social discrimination. As a means of naming and labeling, language is used to make distinctions, to ascribe stereotypical characteristics, to deny basic political rights, or to produce social exclusions that enforce existing social, political, and economic inequalities. Furthermore, language itself can become the object of discrimination. For example, when speaking or teaching a particular language is devalued or even prohibited. And finally, language is also an important resource for confronting discrimination, for example, through critical reflection, conceptual differentiation, new modes of expression, and counter-speech. This raises the question of what happens when language is no longer available as a resource, for example, because it is reduced to a strategic tool that lacks any world-opening and community-founding capacity. To further illustrate the complex interplay between language and discrimination, I will not engage here in the extensive debates about hate speech and incitement. Rather, I will take an opposite approach and ask whether and to what extent hate and hate crime could be understood as a form of speech. This is based on the more general assumption that it is possible neither to gain an adequate understanding of speech and language without considering their violent force, nor to arrive at an adequate account of interpersonal violence without considering its linguistic dimension. In this way, I hope to arrive at a conception of language and speech that accounts for its violent potential while strengthening it as a fundamental resource of articulation and counter-speech. So the starting point of my analysis is the 2012 report Making Hate Crime Visible in the European Union, Acknowledging Victims' Rights by the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, based in Vienna. In the first step, I reconstruct the human rights perspective of the report, which understands hate crime as an abuse of fundamental rights that requires special attention from state authorities. In a second step, I show that it is not so much the brutality of the offense as its linguistic speech-like quality or dimension that is responsible for its particular destructive force. At the same time, it should be not overlooked that discrimination can also take the form of not making a distinction where differentiation could be required, as the above-mentioned examples show. This leads me to an account of discrimination that can neither be reduced to bias motivation nor left to the responsibility of the courts alone, but requires a decisive response from all societal actors, including the courts, politics, and of course, civil society. Although hate crimes are a widely acknowledged problem in the European Union, there's neither a uniform definition of hate crime nor a systematic official data collection that would allow an objective assessment of the current situation. Hate crimes are, as the report Making Hate Crime Visible in the European Union, despite their severity and destructiveness, almost invisible. Currently, they are not specifically registered or evaluated by state authorities on a common basis. Moreover, hate crimes are often not reported or not regarded as crimes at all, with the result that the offenders remain unprosecuted and victims have no access to adequate legal remedies. This is also evident at the legislative level. Only a few states in the European Union consider bias-motivated crimes as a specific criminal offense, even though racist motives are sometimes considered as aggravating circumstances. So in order to address these difficulties, the authors of the report propose a human rights perspective that first provides a useful definition of hate crime, second, broadens the scope of official data collection, and third, strengthens the right of the victims to effective remedy. To this end, the report defines hate crimes in the first approach as violence and crimes motivated by racism, xenophobia, religious intolerance, or by a person's disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Thus, what distinguishes hate crimes from so-called ordinary crimes seems to be the motivation behind the deed. That is, the fact that hate crimes are motivated by prejudices, intolerance, or hatred against others because of their assumed race, religion, sex, gender, identity, or disability. Thereby, the report starts from the assumption that hate crimes, or so-called bias-motivated crimes, do not only violate the physical integrity of their victims, but also infringe fundamental rights, namely the rights to human dignity and to non-discrimination, as laid out by the European Convention on Human Rights and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Article 14 of the Convention states, the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in this convention shall be secured without discrimination on any ground, such as sex, race, color, language, religion, political or other opinions, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth, or status. Property is kind of interesting, I think. It is for this reason that hate crimes require special attention and sanctions from state authorities. For what is attacked in these cases is not only the individual and social group to which it belongs, but also the universal values of human dignity, liberty, equality, and solidarity, on which the European Union is founded. This, however, raises the question, as the report concedes, so why exactly the bias motivation of the offender makes such a difference? If a person abuses another, why does it make a difference whether the offense was motivated by prejudice, as is the case with hate crimes, or by other motives such as anger, indifference, or greed? So in order to clarify this question, the report proposes the following scenario. Person A, in the midst of a heated argument, beats up and injures person B. In a second incident, C publicly injures D in a manner very similar to the way A treated B, except that C's motivation is different from A's. By uttering homophobic slurs, C makes it clear that he is attacking D because he is gay, or more precisely, C believes D is gay. So what is the key difference between these two situations? In both cases, a person's right to physical integrity is obviously violated. In the first instance, the violence arises out of the argument itself and is therefore situational, linked to the concrete circumstances of the argument. In contrast, in the second case, C attacks D because C perceives D as being gay and generally disdains gay people. Consequently, when C attacks D, while at the same time expressing his or her contempt for C, C's bias motive adds an insult to the assault. In other words, C's prejudice against gay people adds a speech act to the physical act, a verbal injury to the bodily injury, by communicating to the victim and the bystanders that the fundamental rights of the victim matter less, for the sole reason that D is gay or perceived as gay. At the same time, this perception is implicitly used to legitimize and justify the offense. Consequently, a hate crime occurs whenever a person is victimized, killed, raped, abused, assaulted, threatened, insulted, etc. for being X or being perceived as X. Well, this perception in turn is used to legitimize the attack. In short, victims of hate crime are abused for what they are perceived to be. Moreover, it is crucial that the supposed feature is not accidental, but rather defines a difference in value that affects the formation of society. Hence, discrimination should not be mixed up with unequal treatment. Discrimination does not mean to treat others differently in a random fashion. Instead, it means to enact and wield a distinction powerful enough to structure society. So discrimination, thus conceived, does not only mean that a person is perceived and treated differently from others, rather certain characteristics are attributed to them that undermine their social and legal status. In short, while discrimination necessarily leads to unequal treatment does not necessarily imply discrimination. If a robber, according to the authors of the report, only robs elderly women, he is not necessarily driven by hatred toward elderly women, but presumably thinks they are easy victims. Consequently, every act of discrimination involves two interrelated aspects. First, the introduction of a distinction that categorizes and denominates persons according to real or alleged features. And second, the use of this distinction as a justification to deny the person certain rights and remedies. This also explains why hate crimes often severely traumatize their victims and the social group they belong to. So while victims of so-called ordinary crimes can attribute their victimization to sheer coincidence or bad luck, victims of hate crimes are forced to accept that their social identity was targeted and that they remain at risk of repeated victimization. Consequently, hate crimes address not only the individual, but also every other person likely to be perceived as having similar characteristics. To take up again the aforementioned example, C's conduct has the potential to spread fear and intimidation to other persons whom he might be labeled as gay. Therefore, C's behavior may affect other persons at risk, similar labeling. These persons may become aware that they too could be victimized, which is a process known as a vicarious traumatization effect. To put it another way, hate crimes are, as it were, contagious. They are able to disseminate and communicate a specific message, a message that is not limited to the concrete situation of the assault, but rather transcends the context of the individuals directly involved, thereby affecting an entire social group that might be similarly labeled. The reason for this is that in hate crimes, the perpetrators are not simply acting on their own behalf, but also as representatives or spokespersons of existing and socially accepted attitudes and prejudices. Consequently, the perpetrator should not be assessed in isolation, but as a representative of widespread attitudes that are prevalent in a society and can be easily invoked and actualized. So, in this way, hate crime speaks and matters not only to the immediate victim, it also matters to persons who sympathize with the offender and whose biased attitudes the offender confirms and reinforces. It also matters to others who understand that they are at risk of similar labeling and victimization. So what this passage clearly brings to light is the linguistic dimension or speech-like dimension of hate crime. If hate crime speaks, as the authors of the report claim, hate crime seems to possess a specific linguistic or speech-like quality. This raises the question of how exactly we have to understand the linguistic dimension of hate crime and of whether this dimension is external or inherent to it. So this brings me to my second point, the linguistic dimension of hate crime. At first sight, the report seems to allow for both interpretations if we highlight the formulation that C's bias motive adds an insult to the assault. The linguistic quality seems to be an external aspect that adds a verbal insult to the physical violence. By contrast, if we stress that hate crime conveys a message that is not just addressed to the victim but to society at large, then speech, broadly construed, is not just an additional aspect of hate crime, but rather an integral part of it. If we follow the first line of interpretation, hate crime could be defined as criminal offense plus bias motivation. The difficulty then would be to identify and determine the supposed bias motivation. Moreover, by explaining the specific nature of hate crime exclusively by the bias motivation of the offender, the legal definition and prosecution of hate crime runs the risk of endorsing an attitude-based criminal law. I don't know the English translation, Deutschen Gesinnungsstrafrecht, and this is closely related to the jurisdiction in Nazi Deutschland, where you were just a criminal because of your conviction or your attitudes. So that is a law that judges the accused less by their actions than by their attitudes, political convictions, or belief systems. Indeed, the authors of the report seem to be well aware of this danger when they stress the following. Those who commit hate crimes are punished for what their actions express, not for what they think. The thoughts, sentiments, or feelings of offenders are irrelevant as long as they are not transformed into actions. Unless there are objective indications of discrimination, the motivation of the offender should not be inquired into. At the same time, however, the report argues, following the jurisdiction of the European Court for Human Rights, that authorities, I quote, have the additional duty to take all reasonable steps to unmask any racist motive and to establish whether or not ethnic hatred or prejudice may have played a role in the events. End of quote. This results in a seemingly irresolvable contradiction. On the one hand, hate crime is defined as bias-motivated crime, whose underlying motives must be unmasked and made visible. On the other hand, not the motivation itself, but only its explicit expression and articulation should be taken into account when assessing the criminal offense. However, this contradiction can be avoided, as I want to suggest, by consistently taking into account the linguistic speech-like dimension of hate crime. For as we have seen in hate crime, a person is attacked not randomly, but precisely for being perceived as X. In other words, hate crime identifies, categorizes, and labels persons according to real or supposed features such as sex, race, class, sexual orientation, or disability. This act of labeling a person as someone or something is already a linguistic act of naming that becomes problematic at the latest when it is associated with the attribution of a social status and the deprivation of certain rights. In the extreme, this can mean that the term human is used exclusively to designate one's own social group. Claude Lévi-Strauss draws attention to this when he emphasizes in his 1952 report, little booklet for the UNESCO he wrote, Race and History, humanity is confined to the borders of the tribe, the linguistic group, or even in some instances to the village, so that many so-called primitive peoples describe themselves as the man, or sometimes through hardly more discreetly, as the good, the excellent, the well-achieved, thus implying that the other tribes, groups, or villages have no part in the human virtues or even in human nature, but that their members are at best bad, wicked, ground monkeys, or lousy eggs. End of quote. Here, discrimination is primarily a matter of naming, calling oneself human, good, excellent, while devaluing others as bad, common, less than human. Moreover, as we have already seen, hate crimes do not only inflict pain on others, they also communicate a specific message on several levels and to different addressees. First, to the attacked individual. Second, to the bystanders. Third, to the social group the individual belongs to. Fourth, to sympathizers of the offender. And fourth, to society at large. In this way, the report for the by the European Agency of Fundamental Rights claims that hate crime is not just an act of brute force, but an overall meaningful speech act that requires special attention. Any analysis of hate crime has to take into account the meaning of actions and how this meaning impacts on social identities. Hate crimes cannot be understood unless one listens to what they say, with all forms of hate crime essentially conveying a common message. In its most general formulation, this message is that the victim's rights matter less, simply because certain features can be attributed to them. This message can unfold its performative power because we are essentially social beings that rely on linguistic acts of address and response for their social existence. We are not born as speaking subjects, rather we are introduced into the social and symbolic order by acts of interpellation and address. and thus constituted as recognizable subjects in the first place. However, precisely because personhood is initially constituted by others in terms of language, we remain vulnerable to symbolic interaction. Hence, personhood and subjectivity is constantly in the making and are always fragile and precarious. Moreover, as already pointed out, the message conveyed by hate crime is not only addressed to the victim and possible bystanders, but also to the social group the victim belongs to sympathizers of the offender and society at large. This is possible because any discriminatory speech act, as Judith Butler emphasizes, works through the invocation of convention. It circulates, and though it requires the subject for its speaking, it neither begins nor ends with the subject who speaks or with the specific name that is used. So, if hate crimes have the potential to harm and injure others, even beyond the concrete scene of address, this is not just because of the prejudices and biases that motivate them, but also because the speech-like quality and the ability to transcend the concrete scene of the assault. This also explains why the physical harm resulting from violence motivated by prejudice is often less significant than the powerful accompanying sense of violation and humiliation. So just think of the scrubbing of the pavements, the so-called Reibpartien, there's no English translation, I think, to which Jews in Vienna were forced by the Nazis after the Anschluss in 1938. Even if the physical violence seems relatively insignificant in comparison with the later atrocities committed by the Nazis, its degrading and injurious message to the victims and the Jewish population is all the clearer, namely that their fundamental civil and human rights are suspended without any possibility to appeal or to legal action. In other words, precisely by conceiving of hate crime as a specific kind of speech and address, its injurious, discriminating, and dehumanizing force comes into sight. However, this does not mean to relativize the extreme physical violence that hate crime inflicts on its victims or to exempt the offenders from their responsibility. On the contrary, it is precisely by taking into account the both act and speech-like character of hate crime that both its specific violating and destructive character, whose effect extends far beyond the concrete scene of address, and the responsibility associated with it become apparent. Furthermore, if hate crime speaks and conveys a commonly understood message that must be decisively responded and acted upon, then surprisingly, language itself seems to provide the vocabulary to illustrate the effects of physical violence. So while it's often argued in the discussion on linguistic violence that we have no literal language to describe acts of linguistic violence and injury, but must resort to metaphors from the field of physical violence, it now seems to be the other way around. We have to draw our vocabulary from the field of language to account for the severity of hate crime and the violence it inflicts on others. We can now formulate a first preliminary result. I've chosen the detour via hate crime in order to demonstrate not only that language and speech imply a violent dimension, but that even the most brutal acts of physical violence need to be reconstructed as a kind of speech, if we are to understand their particularly destructive and devastating force. However, when hate crime speaks, it is not because it uses language in the strict sense of the word, but because it is structured as a form of address that implies an act of labeling and naming directed at multiple addressees at once. As such, a multi-addressed violence, hate crime, just as hate speech, breaks with its context and conveys a commonly understood message directed against the individual, the social group it belongs to, and society at large. This is possible because as a form of address, hate crime and hate speech evoke, reiterate, and actualize social relations of power and domination, as much as past injuries and traumas that are historically sedimented and memorized in speech, language, in the social and political institutions of a community, as well as in the bodies of the individuals. At the same time, it is precisely the general structure of iterability that makes it possible to respond to various forms of discrimination and to counter its destructive message. This is all the more important because human dignity and the right to non-discrimination can never be taken for granted, but have to be confirmed and reaffirmed time and again. So while the law deems human dignity inviolable, Mensch, der erste Grundsatz im Grundgesetz, first ist, die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, dignity of humans is inviolable. While the law deems human dignity inviolable, in reality it's fragile and precarious, in need of protection and defense. Hate crimes therefore require a firm response and assertion. This brings me to my third point, discrimination and the failure to make a distinction. This assertion is addressed to the victim whose right to non-discrimination and human dignity is reaffirmed, to the offender who is made responsible and called upon to respect the victim and the victim's right, and to the public. So in our societies, it is courts that must perform the symbolic function as they have a monopoly on defining criminal offenses. However, this monopoly on defining, especially in relation to speech and language, is not without dangers, as Judith Butler points out in Excitable Speech, and as the court rulings mentioned above illustrate. For if courts or state authorities have the last word on what is sayable and what is not, what should belong to the realm of the sayable and what should be excluded from it, including the very meaning of speech and language, then not only confirm the injurious force of speech, but also limit the possibilities of its productive appropriation and re-signification. Hence, Butler is skeptical about the tendency to delegate the final decision about injurious speech to legal or political authorities. Instead, she asked for a theory of linguistic agency that provides an alternative to the relentless search for legal remedy. And this is not to say that legal codification and prosecution of discrimination are neither possible nor necessary, quite the contrary. But such efforts can only be provisional because the injury is not inflicted by the words themselves, but, according to Butler, by the entire scene of address. Furthermore, we have seen that discrimination should not be equated with unequal treatment. To discriminate is not only to treat people differently, but to establish a distinction that affects the formation of society and the social and legal status of person. Whichever way we turn it, we have to make distinctions, and we discussed this already extensively in the morning sessions. This is, as it were, the paradox of discrimination. Discrimination does not only occur where people treated unequally, when equal treatment would be required. Discrimination also occurs when people and circumstances are treated in the same way, when careful differentiation would be adequate. This is also clearly expressed in a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights of Justice. Treating racially induced violence and brutality on an equal footing with cases that have no racist overtones would be to turn a blind eye to the specific nature of acts that are particularly destructive of fundamental rights. A failure to make a distinction in the way in which situations that are essentially different are handled may constitute unjustified treatment, irreconcilable with Article 14 of the Convention, the article I quoted above. So such a failure to make a distinction in cases where matters are fundamentally different is evident in the Supreme Court's ruling Citizens United. By denying all differences, corporations are equated with persons, and speech and dialogue are reduced to a pure competition in which the supposedly best, that is, most profitable ideas succeed. Or, as Brown succinctly puts it, I quote from Undoing the Demos, In a rhetorically structured field in which the unimpeded flow of speech benefits all, significant differences among speakers disappear. Whether the speaker is a homeless woman or axon, speech is speech, just as capital is capital. This disavowal of stratification and power differentials in the field of analysis and action is a crucial feature of neoliberal rationality that discursively erases distinctions between capital and labor, owners and producers, landlord and tenant, rich and poor. If the idea of constitutional equality still has any meaning here, it is at best an equal inequality for all, as Thomas Lemke suggests following Foucault's account of neoliberal governmentality. If we now return to the Gerald judgment, a similar failure to differentiate is evident in the court's reconstruction of the historical and political setting of his speeches. Accordingly, the majority of the chamber could not rule out the reasonable possibility that Gerald's speeches were made in a context of conflict and were meant to boost the morale of the troops of his camp rather than calling upon them to spare no one. Equally, the majority did not find enough evidence to prove, beyond all reasonable doubt, that Gerald was calling for ethnic cleansing of Bosnian non-Serbs. Thus, the court restricts the context in such a way that no causal link can be established between Gerald's speeches and their alleged consequences. In contrast, in her dissenting opinion, the third Judge Lattanzi reconstructs the context and the scene of address in a quite different way. She not only emphasizes the inflammatory implications of Gerald's speeches, but precisely points to the historical context in which these utterances are embedded, and which is clearly evoked by Gerald himself when he repeatedly refers to the alleged genocide committed by Croats during World War II and calls for revenge. So I come to my concluding remarks. This again brings into play the iterative nature of discrimination. For every performative act requires for its functioning that it can be reiterated. It has to evoke and affirm the norms and conventions that ultimately enable it. Conversely, this means that it is not possible to locate the injurious force exclusively in the attention, authority, or the power of the speaker, although these aspects play an important role, of course. This becomes particularly obvious in sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, or racist speech acts. If these acts possess the power to hurt its adversaries, this is because they invoke, cite, and actualize norms, social exclusions, and traumas that are historically sedimented in language, bodies, and social institutions. Accordingly, the person who incites hatred never acts alone, but as a representative or spokesperson of social power structures, attitudes, and dispositions. Consequently, hatred speaks insofar as it takes up and renews historically established and socially accepted patterns of perception and evaluation. So, hence, discrimination cannot be viewed in isolation and is never simply the expression of an individual, but always a reflection and reiteration of inbuilt tendencies and predispositions of societal structures that make those acts possible in the first place. This does not mean excusing the offender or diminishing their responsibility. On the contrary, it rather calls for a broadened concept of responsibility that is linked to the iterative structure of the workings of discrimination. Precisely because every speech act cites, invokes, and reiterates former injuries, traumas, and exclusions, we are responsible for our utterances. In other words, neither the citationality of speech nor the anonymity of societal structures and institutions release us from our responsibility. Instead, we are responsible for our utterances and actions, as Judith Butler argues, precisely through the citational character of speech. This requires at least a double task. On the one hand, we need to scrutinize, evaluate, and prosecute those forms of acting and speaking that humiliate, disenfranchise, and silence others, thereby posing a fundamental threat to any democratic society and to human rights. on which it is based. For if violence aims at making us speechless, depriving us of the possibility of speaking out and being heard, then the task at hand is to provide conditions to make expressible and hearable the experiences of those silenced by discriminatory practices. On the other hand, we have to make sure not to censor and restrict speech from the outset, but rather to preserve and strengthen it as a resource for speaking and acting in concert. For if our being in the world and being with others is mediated by speech and language, then any attempt to restrict or to regulate certain modes of speaking runs the risk of curtailing speech and language as resources of articulation and counter-speech. Only if you succeed in meeting both challenges, you will be able to respond to discrimination effectively. Thank you.